The Mandalorians have gone through a bit of an image change in the past few years. Whereas the two Mandalorians seen in the films, Jango and Boba Fett, are antagonists, The Mandalorian has created a new image of Mandalorians as a noble, admirable warrior culture. One that sometimes strays into the grey but is firmly on the good side for the most part. Even the Fets themselves have been given a bit of a facelift. As a whole, recent canon media typically follows this approach to the Mandalorians, with one exception. Up until the last episode of Season 5's Mandalore arc, Star Wars The Clone Wars depicted the Mandalorian warriors as ruthless thugs, the evil enemies of Duchess Satine Kryze's pacifist New Mandalorians. Perhaps no one Mandalorian exemplifies this more than Viszla, the leader of the Death Watch faction, an unambiguously evil character that stands in sharp contrast to the Mandalorians of modern Star Wars media. In this video, we're going to be taking a closer look at this Mandalorian villain and examining what he says about Mandalorian culture as a whole.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
In Star Wars The Clone Wars, Viszla was the leader of the Death Watch, a terrorist group that represented the last vestiges of the Mandalorians' traditional warrior culture. His goal was the destruction of the new Mandalorian regime on Sundari, a pacifist government that, Viszla believed, was an affront to everything Mandalore was meant to be. Most of you know all that. What you might not know is that the Death Watch didn't originate from Star Wars The Clone Wars. The Death Watch came from the comic series Jango Fett Open Seasons, which told the story of Jango Fett's life and his time fighting in the Mandalorian Civil War, something that was brought back into canon by the Mandalorian. In Open Seasons, the Mandalorians are a shadow of their former selves, with what remains of their warrior culture divided between two factions. The true Mandalorians adhered to a strict and complex code of honor, while the Death Watch believed that the only laws Mandalorians were bound to uphold was the rule of the strong. The Death Watch was led by a man named Viszla, and over the course of Open Seasons, they succeeded in wiping out the true Mandalorians, leaving only Jango Fett, though Jango eventually killed Viszla and apparently destroyed the Death Watch in turn. The Clone Wars, however, brings back the Death Watch, this time under the leadership of Viszla, who obviously was probably a relative of Tyrese. In the Clone Wars, the motivations of the Death Watch have shifted somewhat. With the true Mandalorians gone, they're focused on taking out the pacifist New Mandalorians. Viszla is willing to go any lengths to achieve this goal, and just like his predecessor, he makes clear that he has no respect for laws or honor, with his only real guiding principle being the rule of the strong. Over the course of the show, he and his followers carry out cold-blooded murders, abductions, intimidation of simple farming communities, and even massacres, sometimes in the name of their cause, and sometimes just for the hell of it. The Death Watch prided themselves on being strong warriors, but they spent most of their time just conniving and preying on innocents. Even Viszla's plan to take over Mandalore had less to do with strength and more with deception. He planned to orchestrate an invasion of Mandalore that would make the Death Watch appear as heroes to the Mandalorian people, radicalizing them back into the old ways to fight off the invaders. Originally, Viszla and Dooku planned to make this work with a Republic invasion of Mandalore, but after his alliance with Maul, Viszla reworked the plan to use Maul and his Shadow Collective as the invaders instead. It was during the execution of this plan that we saw another side to Viszla. Throughout the Clone Wars, he repeatedly reinforced that everything he did was done out of a love for Mandalorian culture and a genuine desire to see his homeworld return to its former greatness. During his first few appearances, he wasn't terribly convincing, especially in his Season 4 appearance, in which all he and the Death Watch did was bullying some random town on the back end of Beyond for no real reason. But when Viszla began his bid for control of Mandalore, he leaned much harder into his stated motivations, and he seemed genuinely convinced that his takeover was right. It wasn't just a power grab to him, and he wasn't just some demagogue. Viszla genuinely believed that his cause was just. Indeed, Viszla didn't seem to care about the power he claimed as much as he cared about the Mandalorians becoming warriors again. When he lost a duel with Darth Maul and was about to be killed, he accepted his fate and handed Maul rule of the Death Watch, affirming that only the strongest shall rule. While his actions throughout the show might have suggested that Viszla was self-centered and power-hungry, when it came down to it, he cared more about the rule of the strong, the traditions of the Death Watch, than he cared about his own life. He died a violent death, but he died knowing that the values he had fought for had won, and so he didn't seem terribly concerned about losing his life. This puts everything Viszla did in prior seasons in a new light. It might have appeared that Viszla was just using Mandalorian culture as a handwave to excuse him and his followers harassing innocents and carrying out acts of terror, but the truth was much more complex. Pre-Viszla genuinely believed that his actions were justified according to Mandalorian tradition, and he wasn't wrong. Earlier, we mentioned that the Death Watch fought in the Mandalorian Civil War against the true Mandalorians over what rules they were bound to, with the Death Watch resisting the true Mandalorians' imposition of a code of honor. Given the brief summary we gave you earlier, you might think of the Death Watch as revisionists fighting against the nobler ancient ways, but you'd be wrong. Contrary to their name, it was the true Mandalorians who were the revisionists. Their codes of honor were a modern invention, an alien imposition on Mandalorian culture. The way of the Death Watch was representative of what the Mandalorians had been for thousands of years, from their first crusades to the Mandalorian Wars to the beginning of their time as a mercenary faction. The true Mandalorians were trying to make the Mandalorians more noble and honorable, but this wasn't something the Mandalorians had ever been. They had a notion of what was honorable and what wasn't, sure, but it wasn't the righteous, noble one the true Mandalorians were going for. By the standards of most Mandalorians throughout the culture's history, nothing the Death Watch did was dishonorable, and their understanding of strength over all else was an ideal that the Mandalorians had held for generations. Previous generations of Mandalorians had considered crimes up to and including genocide to be honorable when it was a show of Mandalorian strength and superiority. The Death Watch was unambiguously evil, don't get us wrong, but they were nonetheless a truer representation of what Mandalorian culture was at its core. The true Mandalorians, as well as the post-Clone Wars Mandalorians factions seen in canon, have far less evil takes on strength and Mandalorian culture, but they were building on rotten foundations. No matter how many codes of honor you impose, the core of Mandalorian culture was about being a warrior, with an overly large focus on individual strength. We've discussed this in other videos, so we won't belabor the point, but any moral code in which might makes right, in which what's construed as strength is upheld above all and what's considered weakness is reviled, is fundamentally corrupt. In that sense, Pre-Viszla represents the truth of what the Mandalorians were. Here's a reminder that not all Mandalorians were noble, that being a warrior and valuing strength wasn't always a righteous thing. Viszla was a remorseless butcher, a man who believed anything was justified so long as he had the strength to back it up. Above all, he reminds us of all the innocent blood that the Mandalorians spilled over the millennia, and that no matter how wholesome Din Djarin is, the Mandalorians as a whole were far crueler and colder than they've recently been shown as. So, that's our look at Pre-Viszla and what he says about the Mandalorians as a whole. But what do you think? Do you agree with our assessment of the Mandalorians, or do you think we're missing something? Feel free to post your thoughts in the comments section below. And as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.